Hello folks, it's Charlie in Westeros here, and today I will be presenting you with a real-life historical figure who bears an uncanny resemblance to the High Sparrow of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. And no, I am not talking about Pope Francis. There are no major spoilers here, but some info dealt with in the book series will be touched upon in this video, so you have been warned if you want to avoid any possible book info. Although I trust you all know who the High Sparrow is, I will give a quick recap of his story before I discuss his historical twin. So without further ado, here's my video on the real-life High Sparrow.
Although his original name is not known, the High Sparrow was a humble septon who began to preach equality among all men and aid the poor while leading a humble life himself. More specifically, it appears that he often denounced and still denounces the excesses and sins of the nobility. As followers gathered around him, and in light of the death of the powerful Tywin Lannister, he gradually made his way to King's Landing to preach his message there. He emerged as more or less the leader of the religious protest movement known as the Sparrows, and his critics started to mockingly call him the High Sparrow in a sarcastic comparison to the High Septon, who is the highest cleric and ordained leader of the Faith of the Seven. Now, he does find the name High Sparrow humorous and makes no effort to hide what action the Sparrows took against the High Septon in the show specifically, although he does admit they could have been more careful. Things take an interesting turn when Cersei tells him that he will not be arrested or executed, but that the original High Septon has been imprisoned instead. Through Queen Cersei's influence, the High Sparrow is elected High Septon, and to further gain his support, Cersei signs a decree restoring the Faith Militant, military orders under the command of the High Septon with the right to bear arms and dispense justice. By the end of both Book 5 and Season 5 of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, the High Sparrow's authority is quite significant. Not only has he locked away the Queen and the Queen Mother, forcing the latter to perform a naked walk of penitence, but in the books, the then Lord Regent Kevan Lannister, along with the other members of the Small Council, are quite irritated by the fact that they have to give in to the demands of this High Sparrow, especially considering how many rebellious subjects there are in the Seven Kingdoms now. More importantly, they do not want to go against someone who is not only a popular religious figure, but also the head of the faith.
So many of you are probably wondering who in our world could be so similar to the High Sparrow of Game of Thrones. I won't deny that there have been and still are many zealous religious figures, cult leaders, and prophets who might in their own way bear some strong resemblances to the High Sparrow. I've also heard some accurate comparisons between the medieval Catholic Church and the Sparrow movement itself. To add on to that contrast, however, there is one historical figure that I find incredibly similar to the High Sparrow. That man was named Girolamo Savonarola.
Born in the city of Ferrara in northern Italy in 1452, Savonarola was a Catholic Dominican friar and preacher who became quite a significant figure in the city-state of Florence towards the end of the century. Unlike the High Sparrow, we do know Savonarola's origins, although, of course, we may yet find out more about the High Sparrow's background in the coming portion of the series. Nevertheless, Savonarola's story begins to converge with that of the High Sparrow quite early on, since at the age of 23, he went to Bologna and asked to be admitted to the order of friar preachers at the convent of San Domenico. It is intriguing to note that Savonarola wasn't necessarily from a marginalized background, as his grandfather was a successful physician who oversaw his education, and Savonarola himself, it seems, was planning on following in his footsteps. What is even more curious, however, is that he gave up this path, and in a farewell letter to his father, he states that he wanted to become a Knight of Christ. What makes this even more akin to the story of the High Sparrow, however, is that there were apparently hints in his letter that he was, quote, troubled by the desires of the flesh. In one of his unfinished treatises, Savonarola also calls on his readers to, quote, fly from this world of adultery, sodomy, murder, and envy. These sins are certainly some that overtly appear to trouble the High Sparrow, namely his televised version. That said, I am only scratching the surface. After taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and being ordained to the priesthood, Savonarola eventually lived as an itinerant preacher with a message of repentance and reform in the cities of northern Italy. Just like with the High Sparrow, it seems that his reputation and mission steadily grew. Finally, one of the princes living under the protection of the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, was so impressed with Savonarola's preachings that he persuaded Lorenzo to bring Savonarola to Florence, as it would bring prestige to the convent of San Marco, which also happened to be under the ruling Medici patronage. And so in 1490, the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, invited the friar into the city. Just as Cersei's endorsement of the High Sparrow would prove detrimental to the rule of the Lannisters, so too would Lorenzo's choice negatively impact the Medicis. As a prophet in Florence, Savonarola's preachings drew such large crowds that he eventually moved to the city's cathedral, something we can compare to the High Sparrow's own move to the Sept of Baylor. Without mentioning names, Savonarola made pointed allusions to tyrants who usurped the freedom of the people, and he excoriated their allies, the rich and powerful, who neglected and exploited the poor. Sound familiar, perhaps? Complaining of the evil lives of the corrupt clergy, Savonarola called for repentance and renewal before the arrival of a divine scourge. If this part sounds quite similar to the Sparrows, wait till you hear the rest. Those who disliked Savonarola would dismiss him as an overexcited zealot and a preacher for the desperate. Even more importantly, they named his growing band of followers the Piagnoni, which means weepers or wailers, an epithet they quite literally adopted. Now, if that isn't a powerful contrast to the twittering sparrows of Game of Thrones, then I really don't know what is. A lot happened in the next 4 years in the city-state of Florence, but I will say this. Buoyed by his prophetic promises and liberation, the Florentines embraced Savonarola's campaign to rid the city of, quote, vice. At his insistence, new laws were passed against sodomy, which included both male and female same-sex relations, adultery, public drunkenness, gambling, and other moral transgressions. Just like the Sparrows of King's Landing, his lieutenant Silvestro Mavruffi even organized boys and young men to patrol the streets to curb immodest dress and behavior. They would create bonfires of the vanities in which they destroyed items like cosmetics, fine dresses, arts, books, and pretty much anything they deemed immoral. At this point, the nobles and ruling elite of Florence themselves dared not fight the growing influence of this religious fanatic, and, left unchecked, Savonarola was able to spread his message throughout a city that was once known for its, quote, vices, going so far as to declare Christ as the King of Florence.
So up to this point, we can see that Savonarola's journey is quite literally on par with that of the High Sparrow of Game of Thrones. While we don't know exactly what will happen with the High Sparrow's quest in the fantasy series, we do, however, know exactly what happened to Savonarola. So, let's examine that and see if his story might not give us a hint as to what fate awaits the High Sparrow himself.
One important difference to keep in mind between the High Sparrow and Savonarola is that while the High Sparrow quite literally became the recognized leader of the faith, in our world the Catholic Church was still led by the much more powerful Pope of Rome. This difference is certainly notable in that it does help create some leverage against Savonarola. Furthermore, although there wasn't any Circe-style ruler-shaming by Savonarola that took place, it should be mentioned that in 1492, the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, passed away and was succeeded by his feeble, arrogant, and undisciplined son, Piero, nicknamed the Unfortunate, who might be compared for the sake of this tale to a combination of Circe and her son Tommen, the king of Westeros. Although there was a brief period of calm at the beginning of Piero's rule, everything collapsed upon the imminent threat of a French invasion of Italy. Seeing this as an aspect of Savonarola's prophetic vision and their ruler giving in to the demands of the invading French, the public took to the streets and expelled Piero from Florence, heralding a period of time in which Savonarola would basically hold power over the city for 4 years, from 1494 to 1498. During this time, and after a short occupation of the city by the French king, Florence refused to assist the Pope in fighting against the invading French army. Angered by his refusal and his claims to holiness, the Pope excommunicated the brazen Savonarola and threatened to impose an interedict on the Florentines if they persisted in harboring him. This basically meant that in the eyes of the Church, and therefore God, the Florentines were excluded from some fairly important Catholic rites. This threat helped uncover the Florentines' anxiousness and wariness of Savonarola. By this point, his campaign against anything fun was beginning to bother and wear on many citizens who were no longer taken with his bonfires of the vanities. Savonarola was also making hints at being able to perform miracles so as to prove his divine mission, and this did not sit so well with other members of the clergy in Florence. Following one of his final infamous bonfires in 1498, a riot broke out against his rule, and rival preachers were also starting to denounce him. It became quite evident that his laws to repress vice and frivolity were no longer popular. Everything came to a head when a rival preacher proposed to test his holy mission by walking through fire. At this point, Savonarola had absolutely lost control of the public discourse. As such, he felt that he could not afford to refuse, and so Florence would have their first trial by fire in over 400 years. The crowd filled the square to see if God would intervene, and if so, on which side. The trouble was that the contestants nervously delayed the start of the challenge for hours, until a sudden rain drenched the spectators. The angry crowd disbanded, and since the burden of proof had been on Savonarola, he was blamed for stalling the event. No longer swayed by his claims of holiness, Savonarola was arrested and imprisoned. Under torture, he confessed to having invented his prophecies and visions. In the morning of May 23, 1498, Savonarola and 2 other friars were led to the main square, where they were condemned as heretics and sentenced to die forthwith. Stripped of their garments in ritual degradation, they mounted the scaffold in their thin white shirts. Each were hanged while fires were ignited below them to consume their bodies, and thus ended the story of Savonarola and his reign of piety over Florence. The Medici family were later invited back to rule the city in 1512, thereby terminating the legacy of the wailing preacher who dared to dismantle the powers that be.
Naturally, I am glossing over a lot of information here, but assuming the story of Savonarola is comparable to that of the High Sparrow, what do you think we can predict for the latter storyline? Will the Sparrows soon try to absolutely remove the Lannisters and Tyrells from power in King's Landing so that they can rule the city exclusively? And what of the massive invading French armies in Italy? Could we draw a comparison from them to the likes of Daenerys Targaryen or Aegon or even another figure in Game of Thrones? And if so, would Daenerys truly put up with these zealous preachers and their High Sparrow? Last but not least, is it the High Sparrow's destiny to be discredited and burned alive as a false preacher? Certainly, time will tell, but in the meantime, let me know what you folks think. Do you agree with my comparison between Savonarola and the High Sparrow? If not, who do you think is a comparable figure to the latter? And most importantly, what do you think will happen to the High Sparrow in either A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones? Anyway, that's all for now, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and certainly don't forget to check out my other videos, such as my discussion on 5 epic weapons that in Game of Thrones that exist in real life, as well as my predictions video for Season 6. Henceforth, I will be posting at least 1 video per week on my channel, so be sure to check back next weekend. Above all, if there is a topic you would like me to cover, please let me know in the comments section below, and I will certainly see what I can do. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed it, and as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. Ciao for now.